Hello and welcome to the 65th San Francisco Film Festival, which, thanks to dedicated Bay Area cinephiles such as yourselves, is the longest running film festival in the Americas. So I would say, give yourself an applause for keeping it going. And I know it's a little counterintuitive in these sort of days still in the pandemic, but we're trying to get more people into the theater. So if there are empty seats beside you and you want to squeeze in, otherwise people might be climbing over you during the conversation, which will be awkward. But so if you feel comfortable, please squeeze together. I'm Kate Mackay, Associate Film Curator here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and we're very happy to, for decades, to have been the East Bay home for the festival. It's always a pleasure to work with the San Francisco Film Festival to bring a hand-picked selection of the best of contemporary world cinema from their lineup to our Barbaro Osher Theater. We have 6 more great movies this weekend after tonight, so I encourage you to check out the schedule and our website for details. Today, we are thrilled to be hosting the San Francisco Film Festival's Persistence of Vision Award presentation, talk, and screening. And we couldn't be happier that this year's recipient, the influential independent filmmaker, theorist, composer, educator, and I'm sure I'm missing stuff, but you'll hear more about that to come, Trinh T. Minh-ha. BAM-PFA is the archive for Minh-ha's work, and we have been screening her films regularly here for decades. On a quick search of archive.org earlier today, I found a wonderful audio recording of an in-person talk she gave at a PFA in 1989. And so that's easily accessible. I encourage you to look it up. But now I would like to introduce 2 special guests who will be co-hosting and moderating the event tonight. We are delighted that Professor Rizvana Bradley will moderate the pre-screening conversation and post-screening Q&A. Bradley is Assistant Professor of Film and Media here at UC Berkeley, and her research and teaching focuses on the study of film and media at the intersections of literature, poetry, and contemporary art and performance. So she's really an ideal moderator for tonight. Bradley's scholarship has appeared in a wide range of academic publications, including Film Quarterly, Black Camera, and Discourse. Her book, Anti-Aesthetics, Black Aesthetics, and the Critique of Form, is forthcoming from Stanford University Press, and the book was supported by Creative Capital and Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grants and offers a critical examination of Black corporeality across a range of experimental artistic practices that integrate film and other media. So that's something to look forward to. And now I'm going to turn things over to Masashi Niwano, SFFILM's Director of Artistic Development. Before joining the team at SFFILM, Masashi Niwano was for over a decade the Festival and Exhibitions Director at the Center for Asian American Media, CAM, the U.S.'s largest media arts organization that amplifies Asian and Asian American storytelling. Prior to his time with CAM, he was the executive director of the Austin Asian American Film Festival, and he has been a jury member and panelist on dozens of prestigious film festivals, including the Sundance Institute, New Orleans Film Festival, and the Frameline Film Festival, among many others. He has participated in various industry conversations with leading media entities and is a Bay Area native who studied film production at SF State University, which makes me wonder, did he study with Minh-ha? But maybe we'll find that out. So thanks you all for being here, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to Masashi.
It's nice to hear your bio. It's fun. All right. Okay, let's see here. All right. Well, once again, hi, everyone. It's so exciting to be here. My name, again, is Masashi Niwano. I am SFFILM's Director of Artist Development. I am thrilled to be here and to be part of this celebration of a filmmaker, an artist, a true visionary who has inspired me and my career since day one. You'll learn more about that in a second. I want to thank the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, especially Kate Mackay, for hosting us this evening and for being such a wonderful partner to SFFILM. As Kate mentioned, before I started SFFILM, I worked at CAM, the Center for Asian American Media. I was their festival and exhibitions director for 11 years. I think we have some CAM people in the audience. There you go. Welcome. Before I was their festival director, I actually started as an archival intern when I was still in film school. So my first role there was to go through their basements, they were dirty, and to go through a lot of press kits, VHS tapes, and I still to this day remember the first time I saw a film by Trinh T. Minh-ha. It was Surname Viet Given Name Nam, and I was so moved by the storytelling and the way Minh-ha explored and represented the experience of Vietnamese women through mixed media, layered texts, and mesmerizing poetry. It was distinct and a voice that I'd never heard or seen before. It's artists like Minh-ha who inspire me to dedicate my life to film and media, and especially to support filmmakers who think beyond the standard conventions of cinema. And I know I'm not the only one. She has impacted so many other people. Established in 1997, the Persistence of Vision Award honors the achievement of a filmmaker whose main body of work falls outside the realm of narrative feature filmmaking each year. This is a prestigious recognition, and some previous award honorees include screenwriter Guy Madden, filmmaker and installation artist Isaac Julian, artist and filmmaker Lynn Hirschman-Lison, and most recently writer and director Dash Shaw with his film Cryptozoo. We are thrilled to induct Trinh T. Minh-ha to this collection of one-of-a-kind artists and auteurs. Minh-ha is a filmmaker, writer, literary theorist, composer, and a distinguished professor of the graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley. Minh-ha, whose work run the gamut from feature films to multimedia installations to books, and she has received so many different awards, from the 2012 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Women's Caucus for Art, the 2006 Trailblazers Award at the MIPDoc in France, the 1991 AFI National Independent Filmmaker Maya Deren Award. Her impressive filmography starts in the early 80s with Reassemblage, then moved on to Naked Spaces, Living is Round, Surname Viet Given Name Nam, Shoot for the Contents, A Tale of Love, The Fourth Dimension, Night Passage, Forgetting Vietnam, and now What About China? I cannot say in words how impressive and important Minh-ha's works are. Each film is distinct, but always a perfect combination of critical and poetic, timeless and timely, and always prioritizing representation over sensationalism. It is my honor to welcome your 2022 Persistence of Vision Award honoree, Trinh T. Minh-ha. Take a picture with this.
Actually, I'm sharing this with Jean-Paul Bourdier, who is the producer of the film. So, Jean-Paul, would you come up?
Hi, I'm Rizvana Bradley. Good evening. Trinh T. Minh-ha has asked me to provide some opening remarks, which I hope will contextualize this film before we begin our conversation together. It is a great honor to be able to join filmmaker, writer, music composer, and philosopher Trinh T. Minh-ha for her acceptance of the SFFILM Golden Gate Persistence of Vision Award and for the North American premiere of her latest film, What About China? Trinh T. Minh-ha's works include 9 feature-length films, 12 books, and 5 large-scale multimedia installations, She has been the recipient of numerous awards and grants, among them the Trailblazers Award and the Deren Award, and her films have been given over 64 retrospectives. It is the first time she and I have had the opportunity to be in dialogue since 2019, when we held a screening and conversation around her 2015 film, Forgetting Vietnam, in Paris. I can't overstate what a pleasure it is to be in conversation again and to be present for the North American premiere of this truly unforgettable film, What About China? It could unfortunately be argued that in the United States, China typically enters into conventional discourse through spectacular images and shallow tropes, overwhelmingly inflected with the cultural anxieties characteristic of Western imperial decadence. What About China takes leave of such discourse and the limited debates it occasions to fashion another kind of question, which is obliquely evoked by its title, a question which could be said to take leave even of the quest for a determinate answer. In addition to receiving the SFFILM Golden Gate Persistence of Vision Award, What About China has received the New Vision Award at the MIPDoc Copenhagen International Documentary Film Festival. The emphasis these awards place on vision is crucial, and a question I'll return to, but it also speaks to the ways Trinh T. Minh-ha's work defies generic categorizations, such as documentary, fiction, or even experimental filmmaking. As we shall see tonight, the very impetus to categorization is ultimately irreconcilable with Trinh T. Minh-ha's filmic practice, whose speculative attunement to the everyday thwarts habitual political, sociological, and aesthetic idioms, and thereby carries or bears something which resists the transparency of representation. The film opens with a slow view onto the Hakka roundhouses, the earthen structures found in the southwestern Fujian province. The constant evocations and explorations of architecture in What About China show us the contradictions that traverse rural and urban landscapes. These structures feel almost like hauntological sites, insofar as they contain and sustain forms of everyday life that are both threatened by and a threat to the developmentalist imperative of the urban, which seems to march inexorably forward. In this film, memory, the temporality and texture of memory, become strange things. Perhaps this is why the film insistently moves through the quality and texture of the low-resolution image described by the filmmaker as, quote, grainy, blurry, ill-defined, in tune with the dirt of life, end quote. But What About China also moves through the haunting register of the ghost. As the philosopher Jacques Derrida notes in his study of hauntological forms, Spectres of Marx, quote, I have just discovered in truth, I have just remembered what must have been haunting my memory, end quote. The philosophical contours of appearance and disappearance, the entanglements of materiality and memory, also seem to occasion the grace of forgetting. In approaching What About China, the literary theorist Lauren Berlant could serve as another guide on memory, when she playfully suggests that, quote, memory is the amnesia you like, end quote. What is the work of memory and forgetting, not only in this film, but across a filmic repertoire replete with reflexive documentary, experimental, and narrative techniques that foreground the art of fabulation, the poetic beauty of cultural passages and returns, reflections of geographies as far as Japan, Burkina Faso, Vietnam, Senegal, and China, and landscapes as distant and as intimate as their impassable histories would suggest. This award speaks not only to a prolific career marked by a practice deftly attuned to the minor registers of transcultural experience, but to a filmmaker, writer, composer, and philosopher who has engaged at the deepest levels with the problematics of seeing. Simply put, Trinh T. Minh-ha's thought and artistry have done nothing less than engender new ways of seeing. This is precisely the cinematic gift she bequeaths to the audiences of her films. We may consider What About China, together with so many other beautiful examples of her craft, as a radical exercise in dismantling the metaphysics of seeing, of visuality and of vision. Here, as in so many other films like Reassemblage from 1982, Shoot for the Contents, 1991, A Tale of Love, 1995, Night Passage, 2004, or Forgetting Vietnam, 2015, all of which were on view simultaneously in 5 small-scale theaters at the NTU Center for Contemporary Art in Singapore from fall 2020 through early 2021, whose spatial configuration took its cue from Trinh T. Minh-ha's exhibition at Secession, Vienna in 2001. The aesthetico-political task is, as this film poetically outlines, to, quote, frame the visible to entice the invisible to action, end quote. In What About China, Trinh T. Minh-ha also reframes the conventional drama of light, enabling us to sense indefinable glimmers of brightness within inexplicable enigmas of darkness. At another point in the film, we discover, quote, reality is musical, the ancient belief, music came from heaven, from the sky's 6th breath. Music being linked to cosmology, listening to the wind is listening to music, end quote. These aphoristic fragments may be considered through the prism of the theorist and poet Fred Moten's claim that, quote, sound gives us back the visuality that ocular centrism has repressed, end quote. What About China challenges us to think about the relationships between sound, music, the visible, and the invisible, often through the work of remediation, calling us to think about its scenes of painterly exposition, photography, performance, music, and the endless extemporization of the arts in relation to a complicated history of displacement and dispossession, but also of making and survivance. In the film, we may discover in the echo of Trinh T. Minh-ha's confession, quote, why does China call to me now? An occasion to gather and convene, to think aesthetically about harmony as a principal life philosophy that is tied to this survivance, which takes shape and changes over time and shifts with the contours of the different generations of people glimpsed here in the irreducible richness of their variegated experiences. What About China underscores this matter of survivance, not of a people in either ethnographic or nationalist registers, but instead in its tracing of the multiplicitous tapestries of life and practice that are immanent to the worlds of those whose socialities have been uprooted by China's dramatic cultural and political and economic shifts. What About China then becomes a broken refrain, and threaded through that refrain is, quote, a song of love for the disappeared. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Trinh T. Minh-ha once again. So we have prepared some thoughts that we would love to share prior to the film and think together about the film in order not only to contextualize it, but to open up different registers for its reception. It's so wonderful to be here with you. I wanted to just say that these questions are slightly elaborate. So I will, in fact, read the questions in their full form. The first question invites you to sort of contextualize the film for us. Can you say a bit about how this film came into being? From the film's variegated narration, one gets the sense that this is a project that may have been long in the making. The date 1993, 3 decades ago, is mentioned a number of times in the film, and this is certainly a span of time that has witnessed immense changes in China and beyond. And yet, as a complexly layered palimpsestic text, which carefully braids moving images, music, and poetics, temporality never seems simple or straightforward. How do you imagine the story of this film's making, and who are your collaborators in this journey? And to preemptively echo one of the poetic refrains from the film, why is China calling to you now?
There are many ways, to tell stories of beginnings. And the film actually offers many entries and many exits. It's not the kind of film that I make are not films that focus on a centralized story or a centralized message. So rather, it's you can see them as a number of threads that one can weave together, and you weave it in the way that you want, as long as it is based on the material that is offered to you. So let's say that one of the beginning is the fact that film is a collective research. And at the time, it was the research of Jean-Paul Bourdieu, architect, visual artist, and photographer, and Hui Zhu, who is at the time a student of architecture, but who has in China, but who has never gotten out of Beijing. So he was very eager to go to the countryside to see. And then myself, very interested in exploring time-based art and also the politics and the arts of everyday activities. So this is, with this in mind, film actually is a form of research in itself. And the second way to approach the beginnings is actually contained in the title, What About China? We are living in a time of uncertainties, and there's always the tendency when we are in dire situation to put the blame on someone else, and hence to forget that we have to look at our own situation and how the problem develops actually in our own context. So there's a saying that you might try to run away from the rain only to fall into the river afterwards. So when people talk about China, one can come up with a question like, what? What about China? Or you can also, in tune with what actually Rizvana has already said, raise the question that every time that you look at an image, the way you look at an image tells you, or what you look at in an image tells you how you look at it. So the what and the how always go together. And what about China immediately arise for me with the question, which China? When? Where? And how? And so we come here into a way of presenting, for example, or representing a situation, a culture, an event, a people, and also the tools of creativity. We come into a situation where we look at everything as a tapestry that holds together the material, because it's a real challenge to make a film without central story and without central message. Not everything goes, unless everything at the base goes. So in that sense, we begin from something that is quite empty, but at the same time, it's an experience that I invite the viewer into that is a bodily experience. Cinema is not merely an art for the eye. Rather, it is a sensorial experience of the entire body. So coming into the film with your body, just as the filmmaker, making the film with the full body involved, the viewing process also solicit that full body involvement. And so that's the second way we can go on, but I think I should stop there.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I mean, I think picking up on your, assertion that film is a sensorial experience, I want to invite you to say something about sound, because in this film, sound and music and the texture of speech, gesture, and song play crucial roles in this film. When speaking about the making of this film, you emphasize that you were not so much interested in creating a new image or new object, but rather fashioning a new seeing. And I think you've spoken to this a bit, which would extend your longstanding commitment to refusing the violence of the ethnographic gaze and your commitment to speaking nearby, right, rather than speaking about. Could you tell us more about this commitment to new seeing and how you see the relationships between seeing, sound, and song in this film?
That's a complex question, right? We can certainly develop much more in the Q&A. And so I'm just giving a few threads here. The question of sound is, for me, very important. The work on the eye and the ear are just as important as, let's say, what you see and what you hear are not necessarily subordinated to one another. They are independent tracks, and one would enrich the other, but they don't exist in relation of subordination and domination. So there's not one element that comes before the other. Rather, the music is very important in the film because the film evolves around this notion of harmony, and harmony begins with music. So the language of harmony begins with music, and of course it has been extended in all kind of direction, where you can see that in the architecture, you can see that in the relation between one person and another, and you can see that as one of the principle of governing that the leadership has taken up. So the question of music is actually exactly how I came in the film. This is another story of beginning. It was, I was in an acupuncture session, and my acupuncture doctor is right here, Jingli. And while I was lying there, waiting, someone just sung right next to me in Chinese. I was so moved and so delighted by the song that it brings me back to all this material. So it's also one of the source of inspiration. It's really the song. And the song, and you would see the music that is being composed also with the film. The breath of the performer who plays the sheng, the mouth organ. It's fantastic. So voice, music, song, all go together. And as you said, I think you bring up this quote, a bird does not sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. So one can also approach it that way, with the film.
That's wonderful. I hope we have time for one more question, maybe, so we can get to the screening of the film. But the importance of the everyday, as we've discussed before, I mean, you have stressed that the singular importance of the everyday, an emphasis which comes out of a commitment to especially feminist filmmaking, as something you cannot take hold of, as it always carries the possibility of something else happening, as you said. And I'm wondering how we can transpose that idea onto your opening conversation, onto our opening conversation about this particular film, which foregrounds quotidian rituals of life-making amidst tremendous forces of rapid and often violent historical transformation. Could you say something about the importance of the habits, rituals, improvisations, and irregularities of the everyday?
Mm-hmm. Well, we tend to think of the everyday as something that we do habitually, that we don't even think about it. It's a routine, and we know it too well. But actually, as soon as one little detail gets off in our habitual routine, we are immediately upset by that. Right? But there's no way that we can control the everyday. It doesn't allow us any hold on it. So you may go out in the street and go to your workplace every day, but something happened in between, and suddenly your take from about that itinerary becomes totally different. So the everyday is not something that is merely habitual. The everyday is something that you cannot always foresee and take a hold of. And this everyday is actually something that the feminist struggle has put a lot of emphasis on. Politics is not merely in the body politic, in the head of state, for example. Making films politically is very different from making a political film. So making a political film, focusing on a political subject and so on. But making film politically requires that every single little element, little gesture, little move that you have be looked at politically. So this for me is very important, to introduce a difference in the way that one makes film, so that everything that you put a frame on is fully charged. It could be something very insignificant, but as soon as you frame it, it becomes charged. And there's a statement in the film that says, everyday activities becoming social comments, everyday activities becoming a link to the cosmos. I don't have the exact line, but that's the statement in the film, so that you can take it very small, in its small dimension, or you can take it in its vast dimension with scope.
That's wonderful. Maybe one last question. Since you spoke to the political and making films politically, I just want to invite you to comment about the relation between aesthetics and politics in your repertoire. You've alluded to the way in which the political and the aesthetic can never be separated in your work, suggesting a need to flesh out the political and the aesthetic dimensions of a given inquiry or poetic intervention so that one is never subordinated to the other. In your practice, how do you seek to resist or refuse the political overdetermination of aesthetic scenes, or conversely, the depoliticization of aesthetic scenes?
Well, the kind of situation that you mentioned can only happen when you work with binary practice, in the sense that you separate politics from aesthetics. So you always come up with situations where you criticize someone for poeticizing a situation or politicizing a situation. But actually, when the two go together and are not in opposition, then whatever you call aesthetic is also a political way of approaching it. Of course, there are limits to what we can do with it. Like, for example, daylight is very different from night light. In the daytime, you distinguish all the forms. So we can be very divisive because we don't like this form or we don't like the other form. And we don't like this color, we like the other color, and so on. And at night, actually, especially at twilight, all the colors seems to come together, so that you have a kind of grayish, multicolor situation. Or further on, during nighttime, you will just have like shadows, and so on. And with that, we work with something that is at the same time very specific. So be political in the sense that we focus on the situation, the very situation that we are presenting. But at the same time, looking at it means also go far beyond it. And in the film, I refer to an ancient art practice among painters in China, where every time they make a painting, there are at least 3 different kind of looks. You look from down up, from up down, or in front and far away. So horizontally and far away at the same time. And I think that with this in mind, we can discuss later on the specifics, but with this in mind, aesthetics and politics are not at all separated from one another.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to screen the film with you, but thank you so much for this initial conversation. It's wonderful.
I'll be presenting to you the people who had been participating in the making of the film after the screening of the film.
Thank you for sharing that work with us. I believe this portion of the evening is meant for audience participation and during the Q&A. But I think Trinh T. Minh-ha and I are happy to also continue the conversation we were having earlier. Okay.
So I just want to introduce to you the members who had participated in the making of the film. And I have already introduced Jean-Paul Bourdier, who did all the architectural research and also the still photography. And the fabulous music composer and virtuoso Wu Wei is not with us, but a number of our talents live in the Bay Area. And so I'm introducing them here. Please stand up and wave from where you are when I call your name. Liz Liu and Ming Bo. Oh. Yes, the beautiful folk singing that you heard is from Liz Liu and Ming Bo. And they are 2 of the singers, in the film. Yeah. And then Haina Jin. Haina? Oh, good. Whose performance of the gujin and the violin remains quite unique. And Yi Zhong. Is Yi still with us? Oh, wonderful. Who has very kindly performed as one of the 4 narrators in the film. And of course, the master of harmonizing, is Dan Olmsted. whose sensitive and terrific sound mixing brings music, voice, and ambient sound fully alive. And Chia Meyer, Chia is Chia with us, whose After Effects work you would recognize in the painterly look of some of the images in the film. And then Emily Chow and Sarah Simga Jaffe. Over here, yes. Whose technical assistants were indispensable at the earlier stage of the project. Thank you so much, all of you. Yes.
Thank you. Well, we would love to invite questions from the audience, but as you're thinking of your questions, there were so many, I think, wonderful poetic assertions, formulations, gestures in the film. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about harmony and as a principle, but also the sort of many different and often contradictory valences of harmony in the film. I think there was one moment in the film where what was narrated explained that censored content, specifically pertaining to sensitive material, was often thought to or deemed to be harmonized once it was censored. And so there are many different, I think, complex and contradictory valences of harmony that we might think about.
I think that in all political situations, you always have people who use certain terms in certain ways, very creatively, and then you have the appropriation of that term by the government, for example, or the leadership. And so there has been, and I don't have to mention all of them, but there had been a lot of struggle from groups of people who are not considered, who consider themselves rather a kind of autonomous region, for example. And all of that is always presented as a question of harmony. So for me, it was very striking. And one of the first things that I learned in the internet world is precisely this creative aspect of netizens speaking about harmonizing everything that is a little bit sensitive. All the words that are sensitive are words that had been harmonized. And also equating the word harmony with the word, the same word that sounds the same, but that means river crab. You know, so what kind of harmony is that? In the film, the harmony is being used in all directions. So I didn't want it to just stay in one place, like, for example, merely in political situation or merely in musical situation, even though music was the most important part, since the word harmony, came from that context. But you have harmonizer of wind and water, for example, in the film. And you have architecture, for example, that had only the wooden house, didn't have any nail in it. And I thought it was so wonderful working with material and environmental material without adding anything that pierced like a nail. And then you have the bridge, for example, the monumental bridge, Chenyan Bridge, which is also built without any nail or rivet. And of course, you have the question of mountain and water, the houses that were built with their front looking at water, but the back turning toward the mountain. There are so many ways, of harmonizing. I must mention that all the definition of the words were inspired by the Yi Jing. So that's why you have this kind of definition that is unusual. Because, for example, joy as the meeting of external and internal, that's a way of speaking about harmony as well. So harmony, the China without and the China within. The China within is so strong, because whenever you go out, you think China is over there, but actually China is over here. And every time you buy anything Chinese, actually China is there. So which China was really the question. And just as with the notion of harmony, you have other threads in the film where if you pull it in your direction, you can do a lot with it. You don't, it's your own thread, in other words, your own weaving, but it's in relation to what is presented in the film.
I think the, allusion to the thread is really important for thinking about your films, which I think you've often described as a kind of multiplicitous tapestry. And, I think you were also alluding to questions about landscape, and I'm really interested in landscape and the role of landscape in this film. The urban sort of industrial city doesn't appear until about 50 minutes into the film. And I was really thinking about the sort of belated revelation of the urban cityscape. And I was wondering, there's so much sort of slow, careful attention given to the rural landscape. And I was wondering if you could sort of speak to the temporality of the film in that way.
Well, first I would address it through what is mentioned in the film, which is the divide between the urban and the rural, and that we know a lot about the urban. Everything, all the information we get is always about the urban, but the rural remain a question mark. And in this case, for example, I gave a date in the film, which is something I almost never do. Except for my very first film, Ressemblage, where I gave the date Senegal 1981. But here I said it out loud, 1993, 1994. So the date, the giving a specific date is actually, in my context, a kind of provocation. Also a way of saying how redundant or how illusory it could be to put a date on the material, even though you can tell by the technology, by the quality of the image, and so on. But putting a date on it is a way of working, first a way of working with the direct and indirect. In sensitive political situation, you can't say things directly without jeopardizing someone's situation. So some of the people who work with me on the film said, we don't want anything political. So how do you deal with that? And it's a big question mark, but it's something that I am also myself sensitive to, living in a situation where there was a time when writing to Vietnam, for example, I had to write in metaphors in order to not to jeopardize someone. And I never mentioned anything about my family, for example. So the question of working with the indirect, you can say 1993, 94, and people will think, oh, that's the past, so you are safe. But actually, why that past now? And so the question, why is China calling me now? And you can see that the questions raised are really very contemporary. Just like the image may date from 1993, 94, but the music is avant-garde, but also classical. So something between avant-garde and classical. And then with that, you have folk music, folk singing, for example. So the date is also a way of putting a limit on the material that you are presenting. So, for example, 1993 is the year that I mentioned of this underground movement in film called the Sixth Generation. And then you have a film like Zhang Yuan's Beijing Bastard that came out, a remarkable film because it's so daring when you are working in a situation where it's very sensitive, to venture that way, to present material in a way that is not conform to the norms of cinema. So it's a film that really made its mark. And I mentioned it in relation to this time. But then later on, as you could hear, Xiaolu Guo, the novelist who is reading from her memoir, she's also a filmmaker, said that the youth at the time, in 1994, is not at all taken in by a slogan like "Unite all workers," but actually they were galvanized by "Unite all angry punk youth."
Yeah, I think the sort of complexities of the different, variegated phases of different lives in the film is really compelling to me. And I was struck by rewatching it, I was struck once again by the, poetic formulation that I think in the film, the pensive image of everyday life evades our grasp. And I was wondering how that relates to so many of the close-ups of faces. There are, I think, very beautiful close-ups of the face that work anti-representationally and don't tend toward the kind of ethnographic gazing. And I'm interested in also Mao's face and the, kind of, as the film describes it, a sort of representational crisis that ensues in trying to represent Mao's face correctly. And I'm just interested in the sort of contrast between the, aesthetic close-ups of faces that the film offers, and the way that those close-ups contravene the kind of Mao representations in the film.
Well, first, a technical detail. At the time, as you could see, it was high 8 video, and then upscale to SD, HD, 2K, and so on. So high 8 video, it's very difficult to work with old technology. And I spent so much time, especially in this pandemic period where you can't have any in-person assistance. You have to work from afar, asking people, writing. You produce volumes and volumes and volumes of writing just because of long distance work relation. And so in this case, the technical question is that with high 8, the best photography that you could do are close-ups. Landscape is very difficult, with video at the time. And that's one thing that struck me very strongly when I was starting to use video after having shot in 16mm and 35mm, is that video is so poor, in portraying something that is far or portraying a landscape. But of course, all of that had changed with digital technology. So in that sense, there is also an awareness that if you have an image from afar, you can't really have a good image. So you have to work with that. And portraits here, as you could see, are portraits, of people in villages. But as you said, depending on how one works with these portraits, it's not only human, but also the non-human that I have lots of close-up of. So you have objects, interiors, how should we say, animals, all kinds of close-ups. It's not only the human, but of course there's a tendency to notice more the human than the non-human. But there's no reason for that. I think the film gives a lot of attention to still objects, to light, to water, to mountain, to all kinds of elements. So portrait is part of it, but you also have portraits of other things, happening at the same time.
We should maybe pause for questions. Here's.
Thank you for such a lovely and poetic and philosophical film. And I think those landscapes were gorgeous too. I wanted to ask you, but I love the music, by the way. It was like, talk about feeling it in the body. I really could feel the music and the sounds a lot. And the folk music, I thought it was brilliant. And I really liked that rooster crowing. And I was wondering, because it's so, I mean, I could hear it from my childhood and, my grandparents' village. I was wondering if you thought of that crow also, that rooster, something from your childhood. And there were moments too when it was almost funny, but it's not funny, but I don't know. It was just sort of like this reaction. And I was wondering if it was something from your childhood that you wanted to share about that.
I'm not sure it's from the childhood, but certainly the rooster is a character, a sound character in the film. Because the way I work sound, environmental sound, and music is to have one prolong the other, so that you always work the music into the ambient sound or the ambient sound into the music. They are not two separate things. Actually, they go together. They, quote and unquote, harmonize with one another. And the rooster, it's when I went through the footage, that's one of the things that I noticed the most. You have in the midst of nowhere this rooster that starts crowing. So for me, it's something that takes you right back into the texture of the village. So texture is visual, but it's also very oral or auditive, right? It's something that you hear very strongly, and it takes you right back into the place, to the place in the village.
Hi, thank you for the amazing film. I really enjoyed the narration, but I have to say I was left wanting to hear from the people who were in the frame. But I noticed that there wasn't any interview of them. Like, you kind of let them be unspoken. So I was wondering if there was an intention behind that choice, and why the film has so many external sound, like how that connects to the theme of externality and internality.
Yes. When I work on interviews, I work on the politics of interview. I work on the politics of subtitle, and I work on the politics of translation, so that you never take for granted any interview. I'm not presenting the viewer with material or with words by how do you say that? Words by the people themselves, as if this is something that is transparent. You know very well that when one works on a film, one cuts, and one cut whatever one wants. So you already form, you already act on it, you already manipulate it. And this is what I brought forward in a film like Surname Viet Give Name Nam, which is different from my other film, because I gave stories of women, of different women from different walks of life in Vietnam. But what I brought in is that even with interviews, I work on the reenactment of interviews. Usually people don't reenact interviews. They use interviews with the fear that the talking head are going to be boring. So they will put in reenacted sequences, for example, to distract you from all these talking heads. But in my case, the talking heads are the main focus. So whenever I do that, I focus on that. But otherwise, I don't see why you have to translate everything in life. For me, it comes from a desire to know. And sometimes it's to know, for example, could be helpful. Other times you have to go non-knowing. Otherwise, you can never go back to beginnings. You can never approach anything fresh. So you always come in with lots of luggage, which is the case that we all go through being in academic setting. So with all this baggage, you can only limit yourself to whatever you can understand. But if you are in a situation where you cannot understand what is being said, then what happened? You would see that whenever that situation comes up, you have to use your other senses. So you approach the image differently, rather than through the meanings of words or through what people say that is being translated. You approach differently, and you can hear the incantation in the film by Annie Huang Shan. This incantation, it's difficult to take words and then sing them rather than simply saying them. So I was always attracted to something that is between saying and singing. And in this case, that's the role, of the incantation of each word. The words being used not only for meaning, but for the music. So it was that emphasis, for example, that could come out when, for example, you don't have translation. And also translation has to be, you see, I did translate what the singers said about their songs because it's something that is relevant. But if you translate everything that happens in the street, you just overwhelm people with needless details. So one has to make a selection in that sense and decide whether you want to work with knowledge or you want to work with a situation of non-knowing. You have the choice rather than always be compelled to translate everything and take everything in through meaning.
That was wonderful. I think we have a question here, but I think that as the microphone is coming, that really helped me think about this film as not having an obvious narrative, but neither is it non-narrative, right? And I think that your idea of the incantation is another option, but I really was trying to think about the importance of narrative here, but it's also really it's important to not insist that it's non-narrative, and the incantatory dimension that you're describing is a kind of alternative to narrative, I think. So that was really beautiful. Thank you. I think.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for the film. It's my first time seeing it. I guess that's true for everybody here. And I was interested in many dimensions, but one of them was the choice at certain points to take an image that we're looking at as an image and to split it to the two sides so that another image seems to emerge either from behind or from in front. And the narration talked about ways of interpreting that a little bit, or I connected some of the narration with about like which China, or I don't have it exactly in my head. But I also was thinking about in relation to Rizvana's question about the faces, there were many moments when a face, there's these zooms. So we're like very close to a face and then we back away into a more distant view where we see the face in context. Or the other way, we start with something far away and we come in to a close detail. And I wondered if you could comment about that and just riff on it a little bit for us.
Usually in my film, I don't use zoom for more detail or for context so much as for rhythm. So the rhythm of the zoom, when you use it for its rhythm, it's very different than just zoom in, zoom out in order to see something better or in order to pull out to give more focus. But if you work with the rhythm of the zoom, then it's one of the element, one of the visual rhythm, that you obtain in the image. did you have something else? I forgot. Oh, yes. Yes. Well, one of the statements in the film talks about how ancient Chinese art, ancient Chinese painters dreams of windows, and how today we continue to dream with mobile windows. So, and also how a frame is a passage. It's a passage in and out, and between reality and imagination, for example. So you have that movement, opening into an image or closing on an image, and every time that you have that kind of closing and opening, actually the sound works on either the breath, the breathing, and then you open, or it works on the sound of a heavy door closing or opening. So it's like opening a key to something that you want to see, in other words.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. I'd like to thank Rizvana and Trinh T. Minh-ha for this wonderful conversation.